Hey, welcome to Module 3.2, Going to Market and Soliciting Bids. In this module, your project for the first time moves outside of your office and your community's vision and goes out into the world. As always, we'd like to thank Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation for their support of this course through the project Community-Led Design for Specialized Housing in the North. As well, we'd like to acknowledge the partnership that makes the certificate possible between Together Design Lab, Nishnawbe Aski Nation, WASA Distance Education Center, and the Faculty of Community Services at Toronto Metropolitan University. As I said, we're entering a new phase in this module where the project leaves the visioning and the hard work that you've done in your office and goes out into the world. For the first time, you're allowing others, your potential contractors, to engage with your project and hopefully attract the best possible bids. What you'll learn from this module is what needs to be done in order to advertise your request for proposals or your request. Once advertised, what steps should be taken to manage the package? And what is a site meeting? And how does a site meeting make sense in the context we're talking about of the North? What you need to decide when you're thinking about advertising your bid is what is the best way to reach the bidders you want, or the bidders you may not even know exist, but who are best suited to your project. In the past, this process was focused heavily on placing ads in local newspapers, posting in construction associations, and relied heavily on word of mouth. And this may have limited the number of potential bidders that your communities would have seen in the North. And instead, you would have got bids from the same old firms who I'm sure you all know. That's totally different now, with most tendering relying, at least in part, on digital advertising boards and reaching audiences across the country. You do still have a number of decisions you need to make at this stage, though, as you put your advertisement out. How long will you post your ad? And again, here there's a tension between wanting to attract the most possible bidders and also not wanting to delay the project or stall things out. When should you post your package? And you may acknowledge that if you post at the same time as everyone else, potential bidders might be busy already submitting bids to those other package. Or if you wait too late, your potential bidders or the best possible contractors may have already committed work to that year's building season. And so it is a delicate thing finding the correct time to be posting your bid. And finally, you need to make sure you know who from your side, from the project team, is going to be responsible for answering any questions that arise. Make sure they're fully informed about what the possible answers are, and also understand the process for answering questions and issuing addenda if needed. The other note I want to leave you with here about digital advertising is that even though most of this now takes place on some familiar boards that we'll come to in a second, you should still be using your network. Does your tribal council have a board that you can post to? Are there other organizations that you work really closely with who may be able to post your advertisement? While more general advertising boards might have greater reach, it might not be the totally most appropriate people who are seeing your ad. And instead, it may be that some of those more local and northern focused or First Nations focused organizations still get you the more appropriate bidders. That said, you should still familiarize yourself with the general advertising boards like Merck's and Canada Buys. That's where a lot of business happens now, and you might want to make sure to ensure the most open and competitive process that your packages or your advertisements are getting up there as well. I have on screen right now some of the standard items that you would include in your advertisement. One of the other great things about using the kind of standard advertising boards like Canada Buys or Merck's is that they make placing an ad so easy. You just fill in their forms and kind of away you go. That said, the information that we have on screen is pretty basic about how they can get the full tender package, the deadlines for submissions, the guidelines for submissions. So it's not hard for you to put something together to use on one of your more localized boards or even your First Nations own website or social media pages. I'm going to show on screen now a couple of examples of what the digital tender platforms look like. If you haven't seen these before, take a second as I scroll through the next couple of slides to familiarize yourself with the information. What you'll see in each of these is that the information being shared is not that complicated and is things you likely already have when you've reached this point in the process. So don't feel daunted by the advertisement and don't feel like you should limit yourself to just one or two platforms for advertising your bid because it's too much work. Remember that your focus in using any of these platforms is about getting the best possible bid, and maybe that means reaching the most possible bidders. And so using all of these standard platforms, your local platforms, and things within your network will really allow you to do that. We spoke earlier a few modules ago now about bid bonds, and I want to talk now about another form of deposit that has become increasingly common and is certainly used on many of the standard advertising platforms that set their own rates. And that's a deposit to receive the full tender package. This deposit is small, let's say between $25 and $100. We have some standard rates on screen here. And it's returned to the bidder as soon as you receive their bid package. And this is just supposed to limit the number of people just kind of asking for every tender package that they see, and instead limit the number of people you're working with in this process to serious bidders. That said, remember that this could discourage some potential bidders from learning more about your project and for learning more about work in the North who may be less familiar with that. It's vitally important throughout the advertising phase to keep track of who has received your full package. Because if you need to issue addenda, which we're going to talk about in just a second, you need to be able to inform everyone in the same way and at the same time. We're returning here to some of the core principles of this course about transparency and fairness, and the only way that you can ensure transparency and fairness is by keeping track of who has requested copies of the tender package and making sure that you're able to inform everyone who has that package in the same way. So that means just keeping a ledger, and I'll show you an example on the next slide of a ledger that has contact information for each potential bidder. A ledger doesn't have to be anything very complicated. You see a fairly basic Excel sheet on the left-hand side here that just has, when they requested it, some contact information and basic information. And remember that when you're using one of the more standard electronic advertising boards, they're going to keep all of this information for you. So it's just about making sure that when you're using more than one platform to advertise your bid, that you're collating or combining all of that information somewhere in one central registry. Now, the process I've been describing so far on how to advertise a bid is really focused on open competitive bids. If you remember the different types of procurement strategies that I went over with you just a few modules ago. If when you were choosing your procurement strategy, you instead decided to go with an invitation or, using that preferred list of bidders that you had, you don't have to go through any of that advertising process. And instead, you're going to reach out directly, usually starting with an email, and then if you need to, by sending the full package hard copy by mail, or there's other ways to share those kinds of documents. And typically, you're going to give 3 to 6 weeks to those invited bidders to complete their full bid. And on this slide, I just have a couple of fairly basic examples. Again, there's nothing that complicated about these invitations. These are form letters, and you'll be able to access these if you're going through the course virtually through the NAN Housing Strategy website. These files are available to you that just demonstrate how you invite a bidder and what the process they can expect is. So this kind of takes the place of the open advertisement, but has many of the same details about the project, about submission guidelines and deadlines. And so instead of posting publicly, you're doing it just through the sample email that you see on screen right now. Now, it's fairly common with an infrastructure project that's being tendered for the owner to offer a site meeting or at least an information meeting so that potential bidders can learn more about the project and the context that the project will be delivered in. These meetings are sometimes mandatory or other times optional, totally dependent on you and whether you think having a site or information meeting is critical to a potential bidder's successful bid. There's a couple of notes I want to offer here. The first is a note that you would offer to any project, wherever it was being built, and that's that you want to make sure that you're not creating undue burden on the potential bidder. And we've talked about this kind of throughout this process of assembling and advertising a tender package, is that the more things you request of a potential bidder, the more the opportunity is that you're going to discourage some potential bidders just by making too much work for them at this stage or creating roadblocks that are too high. The other thing that you want to consider in this context of working in the north is that it might not be feasible to host a site visit. Now, there's some ways around that where you might be able to use some video footage or drone footage to show the site at an information meeting, or, there's information that can be given with the tender package, which we talked about in the previous module, like geotechnical assessments and maps that can sort of take the place of a site meeting. But there is this challenge of ensuring that your potential bidders properly understand the context of working in the north. Now, for information meetings, obviously, in the past, these would have been hosted either in your community or very often, in my experience, you would use a kind of tribal council office in town if your community is fly-in only or is far from a town. But now we've seen almost all of these information meetings move at least towards having a virtual option. So even if you are still doing some in situ in-person meetings, you're offering a virtual option, which definitely expands the number of potential bidders you can access. And so the kind of the advice I would offer here is to think about what's unique about your project or the context that your project is taking place in that you might be able to share through a site meeting or information meeting, and what's the logistical best way to do it so that you aren't limiting your number of potential bidders and are instead even possibly increasing the pool by being able to give really high quality information that supports a bidder. Now, what you may acknowledge from the last slide and maybe from your own personal experience is that there can be questions raised by potential bidders, or bidders may ask for clarification or issues that arise with the package throughout this kind of advertising process. And that can clash with these core values that we've talked about throughout this course of transparency and fairness. How can you answer a question to one potential bidder without giving them some kind of unfair advantage by knowing the answer to that question? And the answer to that is through issuing addenda. And so if you are giving a substantive answer to one potential bidder through a question, and you see here on screen that best practice here is for all communication with potential bidders to happen in writing, both from them and from you, so that all conversations are recorded. But even if you're offering any substantive information to one bidder, you should be issuing an addenda that gives that same information to all potential bidders. And that's really to make sure that everyone is working from a level playing field. And so earlier in the module, when I was explaining that you need to have a ledger of all potential bidders, this is why, so that you can issue clarifications, answers to questions, additional information as addenda, but that all potential bidders receive that same information. Now, some kind of basic facts about addenda here. They should be numbered. Any modifications to drawings should be highlighted. Basically, you shouldn't be making any additional work for bidders through issuing addenda. You should be making things as clear and simple to understand as possible and really supporting bidders in putting together the best possible bids. And a kind of final note on this is, while coming right up to your deadline in the last few days, you may receive a flurry of questions as folks scramble to get their packages together or put the finishing touches on their bids. You should note that best practice is to not answer any substantive questions or issue any addenda in the last 4 days before closing, so that everyone, again, can be working from the same information when they complete their bid. So what you have on screen here and in the next couple of slides are some example addenda. I'm not going to talk you through these, but they just offer you the chance to look through the kind of common language and what these things look like so that you know. Hopefully those last few slides give you some examples of what addenda can look like and how they can be used to provide additional clarity, answer questions, or give more information to potential bidders. And through this module, you should have learned how to take your tender package out of your office and bring it into the world to attract the best possible bidders, and how to think about site visits and how to answer questions potential bidders may have. But as always, if you want to learn more about anything we've talked about in this module, the references are on screen now. Thank you.